What do you say, Mama?
Peeping.
Okay.
Well, Daddy, peeping.
What?
Peeping, Daddy.
You want me to bed pin? What did you say, Mama?
Peeping.
You want me to bed pin? Okay, I bet.
Daddy,
Yeah.
peeping.
I bed pin. Okay. Alright.
Daddy, peeping.
I bed pin. Alright. Oya uru jokama. That's a greeting in my mother tongue, and it simply means good morning, my people. Welcome back to the village. This is Karateng, which is a small village in Kisumu on the western part of Kenya. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome back to the village again. We share a lot of content that relates to things that happen to folks who live in diaspora but choose to return to the village. So join me this morning as I walk around. I'm still spending time with our German Shepherd puppies, and I'm going to be walking around sampling snacks for the kids. And you will notice these are almost purely organic snacks that are not wild. They are planted. Oh, and by the way, I just found out that these dogs absolutely love eating papayas. I've never seen that. This is the first time that I see dogs that eat papayas. And I wonder if that could be a problem. If anybody knows, let me know if I should stop or just let them have it. But the dogs absolutely love papayas. Now, for some reason, papayas are always in season here in the village, almost all year round. Unlike any other fruits, they are always in season. In fact, sometimes we have so much of it, we end up giving it to the neighbors and the kids around. Unfortunately, sometimes our kids actually end up destroying the ones that are not mature. But anyhow, today, as I prepare to get some snack for the kids, I want to talk about the issue of language for kids, especially the question as to which language our kids should learn and what that means for people who are planning on returning to the village, hopefully with their kids. So I'm going to talk about how diaspora parents navigate this issue of language acquisition. I'll talk about the challenges we run into, the opportunities that are out there, and share a little bit about our personal journey. But before I go too far, let me start by talking about the research around language acquisition. Now, this is one of those places where I say this is not my personal opinion, and you can read about it out there. There's so much research on language acquisition that you can access very easily, even by simply Googling. So here are some of the few things we've learned about language acquisition. That number one, nearly all kids, even nonverbal kids, can learn or are capable of learning any language. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about Russian, Swahili, sign language. Nearly all kids are capable of learning languages. In fact, they will often languages that are not even spoken by their own parents. When given the opportunity and the support, every child can learn any language. Unfortunately, this ability to learn language is often most active before kids get into puberty. As people grow older, their capacity to learn languages drastically reduces. Although there are some exceptions, there are people who are still really good at acquiring languages later on. But most kids can learn a whole lot when they're younger. And we know from research that being bilingual or multilingual is massively advantageous on so many levels that I'm going to highlight later on. And so it's a good thing when a person is bilingual or multilingual. And of course, native languages are not a barrier to acquiring other languages. I know that runs against every myth that we were raised with, but yes, learning a native language has nothing to do with one's ability to learn other languages. So for those of us who live in diaspora, and to some extent, those of us who live in cities in Kenya, the following things are true. That number one, the majority of our kids end up being monolingual in a sense. They don't pick up other languages in a way that is functional, especially native Kenyan languages. While many of us still really desire to pass along the languages that we speak to our kids. Now, keeping in mind that an average Kenyan who grew up around my time speaks anywhere from 3 to 4 languages. So many of us still wish that our kids could pick up our languages, but that is not always the case. And in fact, sometimes, unfortunately, some of us intentionally prevent our kids from learning other languages, but others simply fail in our efforts to get our kids to pick up whatever language we speak. Now, the other unfortunate truth here is that as we do this, we also contribute to the loss of a critical cultural element, which is our language. In fact, in America, I was shocked to find out that native languages are almost non-existent in American schools. They will offer kids all kinds of languages except for Native American languages. I'm sure there may be exceptions out there, but they don't teach kids Native American languages. And what they do here is that in many cases, the quote-unquote foreign languages are introduced much later on when the kids are much older and won't be able to use any additional languages in a functional way. So one may wonder, why is this a problem? Here's why. Number one, it is often way more difficult for kids who have not picked up African languages to integrate when they come back to Africa. It always keeps them in that box where they're seen as foreigners, particularly when they don't speak our native languages. So the opposite is actually true, that diaspora kids who speak native tongues fit in very, very easily. And in fact, people absolutely love it when a kid comes from diaspora and he or she is able to speak native tongues. Sometimes my daughter sprinkles a little bit of Luo in her sentences, and my folks absolutely love it. And so there are other unfortunate parts too, and this is all from research, that kids who grow up monolingual end up missing out on all the benefits of being bi or multilingual. Because we know that teaching and learning in mother tongue, for example, builds strong foundations for a child's cognitive development, improves communication skills, literacy skills, social skills, critical thinking, and many, many other things. So we know that exposing kids to other languages is really, really beneficial. But this is not always the case for our kids in terms of the opportunities to learn. So here's why I think this happens. And if there's a reason I've forgotten out there, please let us know. But here's why I think this happens to our kids. Number one, I think our kids fail to learn other languages in part because the English language and culture is really dominant in America and in the Western world for the most part. And I see the same thing in Kenyan cities as well, where the cartoons that the kids watch, the people they interact with, the schools they go to, it's always English, English, English. So that dominance of the English world makes it really difficult to insert something other than English. And of course, as parents, we are products of colonialism. And so some of the challenges that we grew up with, like being taught that our languages were inferior, still linger many years after we moved away from Africa. And so, of course, we have our desire to have our kids fit in. And so some of us think that if we get our kids to speak whatever their friends are speaking, then it's easy for them to fit in. And to some degree, that is true. And then there's also issues of just lack of awareness on our part. For example, sometimes I tell myself that I speak English quite a bit most of the time. And so my kids end up speaking English, even though I know I could be speaking other languages with them. There are those of us who associate English with a higher status. And then there are people who think mother tongue is actually problematic because it interferes with kids' development of other languages. Something that is totally untrue. And of course, we give ourselves all kinds of explanations, excuses like when we are married, when we live in cross-cultural marriages, when your spouse speaks another language, then it's more difficult to teach your native tongue. Sometimes we say we don't have time, plus many, many other excuses. And unfortunately, sometimes there are kids who have language-related delays. And so as parents, we worry that when the kids are still struggling with language-related delays, then it might be a challenge to add something on top of it. I'm not sure how that works. But I'm sure there are many, many explanations for why our kids really struggle to acquire other languages. Some people have actually even told me that they believe that when the kids are monolingual, then they have a much better chance of advancing within the American society. How true that is, I'm not so sure. But there's lots of reasons as to why our kids really struggle to learn other languages. But part of it, especially as you move through the generation, the language sort of disappears. I've seen this even in my neighbors' cases where you see like a third generation American who initially when the families moved in, they were speaking some kind of a language, typically Spanish. And as they move from one generation to the next, the language part disappears. And so all of this, I think, is still tied to the dominance of the English culture and the effects of colonialism. Keeping in mind, especially if you didn't grow up in Kenya, you may not be aware that we were always punished if we spoke something other than English, which in a sense made us think that our languages were inferior. So as parents, we still walk around with some of those challenges. And so there's lots of reasons why our kids don't end up acquiring the native languages that we come with from Kenya. So here are some suggestions that folks have offered out there that I think may work that folks can consider. For example, number one, if your child was born in Kenya and they acquired, say, Swahili or some other native tongue, when they come to diaspora, please keep using it. Because when the kids are younger, if you stop using the language they brought along, they end up losing those languages. So those who are lucky enough to come with kids who already speak other languages, whatever you do, please keep using those languages because they will be lost if they are not used. And then the second thing which we do too, my wife and I, is the issue of exposure. To the extent possible, expose the kids as much as you can within your means. Typically what I do at home, for example, I give them instructions in Luo. I send them, go get this, go do that in Luo. And over time, I notice they put it together and then they start using it in sentences. It's still a very tough process, but we try to give them exposure as much as possible. But besides just speaking your tongue, you can also expose them to books. There are lots of cartoons in Swahili. And then travel. When they go home, they get to use mother tongue. However, unfortunately, when our kids go home, everybody uses English when talking to them. And so as a parent, you want to keep in mind that being at home is also an opportunity to learn. So keep reminding folks to use Swahili and other native tongues while talking to the kids. And when you do that consistently over time, they actually pick them up and they learn quite a bit. So keep reminding folks, both adults and kids, to speak to our kids in Swahili and other native tongues. Now, if at all possible, you can consider sending them to local Kenyan schools, even for a day, especially when they travel for summer visits. Typically, when it's summer in the US, the kids in Kenya in school. So if you can send them to school for even one day, even just for a few hours, they might pick up something here and there. And then, of course, within the US, we have certain programs called dual immersion programs, especially in Southern California, where we live. There are many opportunities where our kids get to learn both in Spanish and English. So if you find a dual immersion program, put your kid in there, they will absolutely acquire another language. And it doesn't even have to be your native tongue. They will still acquire whatever language they expose to them. But the most effective method that I've seen consistently is one where a parent communicates to kids 100% in their native tongues. The kids will absolutely acquire and use those languages. So that's the one method that I know works very effectively. Now, that said, you also want to keep in mind that some kids are going to have a much harder time with the language than others. And so you want to be patient and make sure you're moderating your expectations just depending on a child's ability. I'd be curious to hear what you guys are doing up there as far as language and your thoughts. Well, I hope this was useful and I will see you in the next. Thank you.